I spend a lot of time talking to trade unionists right across the country. Favourite part of my family heritage, back to my great-granddad who had his wages docked in the 1926 general strike. We're still going to get revenge for that at some point. My dad himself was a Unison senior shop steward in the mid-90s, and again, fortunately led a struggle where they also lost their job. Lots of glorious defeats in my family. In fact, Manuel here knew my uncle, who was also a firebrand leftist in the early 80s back in Scotland, and I think you were both young firebrand socialists. I don't know which CLP it was. The trade unionism is something which I was raised to see as very much the only hope, in a way, of progressive politics. Now, in terms of the state of the trade union movement, Ian was very candid about it. It's very important to be candid about it because it is a crisis. Over half of workers were unionised in 1979. It's just over a quarter today, about 6 million. Low-paid workers are the least likely to be unionised, people on £7 or less. In the public sector, over half of public sector workers are unionised. In the private sector, it's just 14%. Most of those workers themselves used to be in the public sector, thinking of utilities, the railways, so on and so forth. Young people, also less than 10%, I think it is, the latest figures of 18 to 24-year-olds are in unions. But that said, when we're making a case for unions in politics, we have to emphasise the legitimacy of the trade union movement as the biggest democratic movement in this country by a very long way indeed, representing over 6 million workers, ranging from nurses, teachers, lollipop ladies, bin collectors, and so on, the pillars of any decent society. Now, if we're going to address the lack of representation of workplace issues in the political sphere, it does have to come back, as Ian put it so passionately, to working class political representation. If we look back to the 1945 Labour government, other than the Prime Minister himself, Clement Attlee, the three pillars of that government were Herbert Morrison, Ernie Bevan and Nye Bevan. And they had come up either through the trade union movement or local government, or a combination of both. And it was those democratic avenues, of course, which in the 1980s got such a kicking. But it's through those avenues we got working class people into politics. You could articulate the issues that affect working people on a daily basis because they were lived experiences of those people themselves. And it comes back again, if we're going to get workplace issues talked about seriously in politics, then we have to have people who've been working as call centre workers or nurses or frontline public sector workers. We need to get those people into Parliament so they can articulate that, but also in a way which resonates with people. That means a very strong and uncompromising defence of our trade union link with the Labour Party, which is the most representative section of the Labour Party. I'm a Labour Party member, but we have to be honest, the Labour Party membership itself has dwindled to such an extent in many places it can hardly be seen as particularly representative of the local communities which it exists to serve. The trade union that remain affiliated to the Labour Party, on the other hand, of course, do actually represent people in working class communities which the Labour Party was founded to represent. That also means the unions themselves are using that trade union link far more effectively than they often do, rather than just possibly giving a blank cheque in the past. They're actually on the basis that they not only are the most legitimate democratic movement in the country, that they, of course, keep the Labour Party afloat, but that they also need to get something back in return. And that, of course, means getting the Labour Party to represent those issues which are so important to their members. That's particularly important at the moment because we have an all-out assault on what remaining rights working people have in this country. We talked about, of course, facility time, which Ian talked about. We of course have the doubling of time which workers can take their bosses to an industrial tribunal. They got Adrian Beecroft, a billionaire asset stripper, which is the Tories. They hired Adrian Beecroft, this Tory donor and asset stripper, to draw up a charter stripping what remaining rights working people have in this country. He actually had the audacity to call Vince Cable a socialist, which is the worst smear against the good name of socialism I've ever heard in my entire life. But these are assaults which are, in the moment, happening, and unfortunately we are on the defensive. We've been on the defensive for a long time, and rather than going on the offensive, arguing for more rights, we're often on the back foot, trying to hold on to what remaining rights working people have in this country. Now, in terms of issues which I think, other issues which need to be discussed, we need to look at the changing nature of the workforce. The fact now we have more call centre workers, well, as many call centre workers as used to work down the mines at the peak of the mining industry, over 1 million. And these are conditions which are often very oppressive for call centre workers, sitting often in rows, not being able to communicate with each other, sometimes having to put their hands up to go to the toilet. These are conditions reminiscent of 19th century Victorian factories. Now, these are areas often with very low union density, and there's a huge requirement of trade unions to go into places like call centres or retail, the second biggest employer in the country, where you also have a move towards those sorts of conditions, and champion both rights at work, but also against those sorts of oppressive conditions, against the often tedium of work which exists because of those lack of rights and the dehumanising effect of having to put your hands up to exercise your basic bladder functions. We need to talk about the rights, the lack of rights temporary workers have in this country. That brings down the terms and conditions of other workers, of course, because the lack of their rights means that they know they can hire people prepared to work on poor conditions, and that drags other people down. When it comes to immigration, we have to take on a lot of the myths about immigration which do exist, but then again we have to stop a race to the bottom where immigrant labour would be used by employers to drag down terms and conditions by ensuring all workers are employed on the same terms and conditions, having a living wage and improving trade union organisations to make sure they're recruited, to stop immigration being used by cynical right-wing politicians and others to turn working people against each other. And finally, the argument we have to make about trade union rights is pretty clear, that even during the boom time, even when in 2005 we had record corporate profits, the real income of working people was already flatlining or declining. From 2004 onwards, that was 4 years before Lehman Brothers came crashing down, if you're in the bottom half, your wages were already flatlining. If you're in the bottom third, your pay packets were actually declining year after year. And that, one of the key reasons, is the weakness of our trade union movement. So one of the arguments we have to make in the political realm is that the real pay packets of workers, this squeezed middle, whatever they want to call it, a phrase I'll be honest I hate, but the idea of working people's incomes declining, which forced so many people onto cheap credit to keep on to what the living standards they had at the time, that partly comes down to the weakness of trade unions to stand the ground of their members. So I think these are arguments we have to make, particularly at a time, of course, when austerity is being used as an excuse to strip workers of their rights. But we have to have far more confidence as a movement, as the most legitimate democratic movement in the country, when there is an open door, when policies such as the ones we're arguing have more potential support than they have had for a long time, and where I think we can fight to have a sympathetic ear in the Labour Party. So let's work with politicians like Ian and others to help build a stronger trade union link that can more effectively represent the needs of working people.
Thank you.